Hi, everybody. I am coming today to tell you about another situation that I am currently going through. Just to kind of revisit a little bit of my background. This is a post regarding blood clotting disorders, and I did make a video about that last year. I also made a video called My Placenta Previa Pregnancy. So if you're interested, you can feel free to look for that one. That's going to talk a little bit more about my last pregnancy and the issues that I had. The other video that I made about the blood clotting disorders is, I believe, called Blood Clotting Disorders in Pregnancy. And I also made that video kind of early on when I discovered about that I have a couple blood clotting disorders and I understand them a little bit better now. So today I wanted to get a little bit more in depth. So those are two other videos that you can look for if you want to watch those. But so today, like I said, a little bit of background in case you haven't seen my other videos. I have 5 living children and I have had 2 losses. Of my 5 living children, 2 of them suffered strokes in utero. And then only 2 of them were born completely healthy. My most recent baby, that's the placenta previa baby, was born last year. So 13 months ago, I delivered her. And it wasn't until I was in the hospital during my pregnancy with her when I finally had a doctor start to question whether or not I had blood clotting disorders. So background here, these kids, my second pregnancy was a loss. My first pregnancy was a completely healthy baby. My third pregnancy was my first child to have a stroke in utero. They recommended blood clotting tests after he was born, but it was a very long and complicated situation. It's not just a blood stroke that he had. He has other issues with his brain. If you're interested in that, there's a video about him called My Miracle Boy. But anyway, he had a stroke, and they did recommend doing some blood clotting tests. But at the time, he was in the NICU already, and he was there for a while, and they were doing other blood work, and they basically said, "Oh, we can't take this much blood from a baby, so we're gonna just wait to do the blood clotting tests, and you can do them outpatient." And the kid has been through so much. He had neurosurgery when he was 7 months old. He's been through a lot, and so I didn't want to put him through another thing, to have him have blood drawn for a blood clotting test. And I basically asked the doctor, I didn't know I had any blood clotting disorders, so I didn't think that he did either. They made it seem like it was a fluke that he had a stroke. And I asked the doctor, well, if it comes back that he has a blood clotting disorder, then what are they going to do about it? And he is like, well, they're not going to do anything about it. And I'm like, well, why do it then right now? So we have never had him tested, actually. And then after him, I lost pregnancy at 15 weeks, and that was due to a subchorionic hematoma, which was a blood clot in my uterus. It had developed early on. I started hemorrhaging at 10 weeks, and that's when they discovered I had the subchorionic hematoma. 97% of the time when you get a subchorionic hematoma, which, like I said, is just a blood clot, it develops typically around implantation, and then it's just basically broken capillaries that sometimes don't close up right away, and they bleed for a little while, and it forms a little clot, and then eventually, usually 97% of the time, those clots dissolve, and then you go on with a healthy pregnancy. In my case, it didn't go that way. They weren't very invasive. This was early on, like I said, 10 weeks, so it wasn't like, oh, well, we need to deliver her baby now or whatever. It was just like, well, let's cross our fingers and hope that it resolves and you go on to carry this baby. But it was 5 weeks of hemorrhaging before my body couldn't take it, and I literally just went into labor. Like, I had contractions, and they were regular, and then eventually my body just basically expelled everything that was inside it, including the baby, unfortunately, and that was 7 years ago. again, they said that this happens to a lot of people and it's not necessarily related to blood clotting disorders. So they weren't like, hey, let's test her and find out if she has any. Um, it doesn't help that I was going to a different hospital. Like, when I lost that baby, I didn't even go to my doctor because the hospital that was closest to me was not the hospital where my doctor had privileges. So they didn't even know me there. So they didn't know my history and they weren't like, hey, let's test her for this or whatever. So that was my fourth pregnancy. And then my fifth pregnancy was a completely healthy baby. I did not have any problems during that pregnancy at all. Of course, I was very nervous because I had lost one, and before that I had my baby with the stroke and the other brain issues, and I lost one before that. So I was a nervous wreck, but I did, deliver a completely healthy baby, and it was a very good experience. So then my pregnancy after him with my daughter, who is now almost 3, the pregnancy was very healthy, but they were very cautious because of, ever since what I went through with my son and his stroke and his brain issues. So they kept a close eye on her, and I followed with a maternal fetal medicine specialist for an ultrasound, the anatomy scan, just make sure her brain looked okay. But she always looked healthy. We didn't have any problems with her. And so I delivered her full term, and we didn't know that she had had a stroke until she was a couple hours old and she started having seizures. It turns out she had had a stroke that caused a brain hemorrhage. So she had to be in the NICU. She was very sick. If you want to hear about her story, that's Seizures to Success. That's my daughter Avila's story, Avila. So if you are interested in hearing more about her story, like I said, I have a video about her too that's got a little bit more in-depth information. But Avila went to see the doctor for a while because she was on medication for seizures. She came home from the NICU on medication. So she had to see the neurologist for follow-up, and they wanted to do blood clotting tests on her. And I was like, well, this is a different situation because she's not being drawn over and over again like my son had been. And she was a few months old, and I'm like, this is the second baby who had a stroke. So whatever test they want to do, I'm going to let them do it. So I took her in, and they drew her labs when she was little. And they actually gave me the results. Her neurologist gave me the results, which was a bad idea because I didn't realize this, but I realize it in retrospect. The neurologist read me these. She's like, everything's normal. It's all fine. You don't have to worry about anything. No, there's nothing wrong with her. She doesn't have any blood clotting disorders. This, must have just been a fluke. Well, neurologist's not a hematologist. So if there is something that comes up as a positive, that she has a certain issue, they're not necessarily going to know what it is and what to say about it. So this particular doctor told me everything was fine. And she handed me paperwork, like from the visit, but I didn't really look at it because I was like, I don't have any questions, it didn't really have any pertinent information that I knew of. It said like reasons for the visit and, what her issues were. And it was like, history of seizures, history of family member who had a stroke, history of stroke, history of, whatever. And I knew about all that stuff. So I didn't like go reading through all of it. She was like, there's nothing on her test. So I didn't go reading through it. So then my seventh pregnancy, again, if you want the details, this is the My Placenta Previa video. But I started having problems early on where I was hemorrhaging, and it was 11 weeks that I started bleeding with her, thinking that I was miscarrying, and came to discover that I had low-lying placenta, which in time turned into placenta previa. But I bled every day for 15 weeks. I ended up hospitalized overnight once at 19 weeks, and then sent back home on full bed rest, terrified out of my mind, hemorrhaging every single day. But they said, oh, not enough for a transfusion. But if it gets suddenly worse, you need to come back. So I ended up back at 23 weeks and 2 days because it got really bad out of nowhere. And that's when I started having transfusions. So I ended up having 16 transfusions altogether. over a period of 25 days. I delivered her on my 23rd or 22nd day in the hospital, and then I was there for 3 more days because I had a C-section and I had transfusions and stuff that I had to have then too because I had lost so much blood. But the question everybody had was, okay, placenta previa can cause bleeding. Sometimes it doesn't, but it causes intermittent bleeding usually. It'll be like someone's, got a bleed and it lasts for a day or an hour or whatever. Sometimes it's a lot of blood, sometimes it's a little bit, but typically it doesn't last very long. And after so many episodes of bleeding, you get hospitalized. But most of the time, those people can carry their babies to at least 36 weeks, maybe even longer than that. Some people go all the way till their scheduled C-section at 38. But in my case, they were like, we don't get it. Why is she bleeding? Why is she, and they can't inspect, they can't do an internal exam. They can't, when you are bleeding and you have placenta previa, they need to stay away from the cervix. So they weren't able to go in there and really look at why is she bleeding every single day. But from abdominal ultrasounds, they were able to tell that from early on when I started bleeding, from the very early on, that by 16 weeks, I had a visible clot in my uterus. It was actually right at the base of my uterus, just laying on top of the placenta, or on top of the cervix, basically. So they said it was raising the placental edge. So what we're talking about is a clot that had formed that was wedging between the uterus and the placenta. So if this is the placenta, this is the uterus, this clot was in between those. And what happens when your body bleeds? Well, your body realizes it's bleeding, and your body's way to stop bleeding is to form a clot. A healthy body forms a clot and successfully closes off the vessel that's bleeding because the clot forms in the walls of the vessel and it stops the bleeding, and then it heals. Eventually the clot dissolves, and then the vessel's closed off and it's not bleeding anymore. But in my case, I have what they call Prothrombin Gene Mutation. It's also called factor 2. It's something I've had my entire life. And like I said, for more information on what that particular thing is, you can look for the blood clotting disorders in pregnancy video that I made if you want to watch that one. But I didn't talk about what I'm talking about right now in that video because I didn't know then what I know now and how I understand it. So basically, my body was making this clot, but it was inefficient. And because I produced too much thrombin, that means my blood has a greater ability to clot. It went ballistic and just made this huge clot that was not effective. The clot didn't sit inside the vessel and close it off. The clot just grew in my uterus. So what happens when, your uterine wall is here and the placenta is here and there's a clot in between? If you continue to bleed, that clot is going to just keep growing. And most people, if they have a clot, eventually it'll just kind of break down. But when you produce too much thrombin and you have factor 2, that clot continues to grow and grow. And so what happens is as it grows, that space that it's blocking between the uterine wall and the placenta gets bigger and bigger. And so more and more of the placenta starts detaching. Therefore, the bleeding becomes greater because more vessels are being forced to be pulled away from the placenta. So the uterus is actually bleeding because the placenta is pulling away from it because the clot is actually forcing it. This is called a chronic abruption. So chronic abruption is when, placental abruption is when the placenta is detached from the wall of the uterus. But a chronic placental abruption is when it continues to happen for a period of time. Chronic. So it's not something that's acute. It's not happening one time. It's happening continuously, daily. It's, permanent in this case as far as the rest of my pregnancy goes. There was it was going to heal or whatever. So what does this mean for pregnancy? Well, obviously, the less of the placenta that's being fed by the uterus, the less the baby is being fed, the less nutrients that are getting to the baby, the less blood flow, oxygen, all of that. So you can end up with a baby that's not growing so well. You can end up with a baby that is suffering from a hypoxic situation. So they're basically not being given enough oxygen, and that can cause brain damage. And not only that, but there's only so much bleeding in blood clots that the uterus will be able to stand before it tries to start getting rid of what is inside it. Blood is very irritating. So you have contractions and things like that eventually, because your body is like, hey, we need to get this out of here. It knows that there shouldn't be blood in your uterus. So obviously not good when you're pregnant and not to term. In this particular situation, there was nothing they could do besides band-aid my pregnancy by giving me blood transfusions. They tested me while I was pregnant. We didn't know I had the factor 2 yet. We knew that I tested positive for lupus anticoagulant, which is another blood clotting disorder, but that's acquired. It's not genetic. But I needed to be retested for it because they said that just one test in and of itself that shows positive isn't necessarily a true positive. It could be what they call a transient positive, which means that you test positive for it now, but it could be as a result of pregnancy and bleeding and all these other factors. So 6 months postpartum, I needed to be retested for it. And that's when I made the blood clotting disorders and pregnancy video. So that's when I discovered I have that and factor 2, double whammy there. So when all was said and done, I made it to 26 weeks and 2 days into my pregnancy before the baby started showing signs of distress, and I went into labor. I started having contractions regularly, and they gave me magnesium sulfate to try to stop them, and they weren't able to stop them. So there was no choice but to deliver. And like I said, she's 13 months old now. She's doing well. You know, she still has some preemie issues. You can watch my other videos if you want to hear about that. But relatively well for a 26-weeker preemie. She's doing very well. So, but anyway, so the things I wanted to talk about today are, first of all, how those blood clotting disorders affected my pregnancy, and that they aren't necessarily going to like affect everybody's pregnancy like that. And placenta previa won't affect everyone's pregnancy like that either. If you don't have any blood clotting disorders and you have placenta previa, chances are you're not going to have the kind of situation that I had, just because you have placenta previa. But if you have placenta previa and blood clotting disorders, yeah, you got problems. If you have any kind of problem that would cause bleeding or need a C-section or anything like that when you're pregnant, and you have any blood clotting disorders, then yeah, it could cause more problems. But if I had known that I had these blood clotting disorders, we could have at least got me on some medication to help when I was pregnant. But unfortunately, we didn't know this until afterwards. So what I found out right around the time when I found out I have the factor 2, I just happened to be looking through some old documents, and I came across my daughter, my almost 3-year-old's documents from when she had a blood clotting disorder, or blood work done. And like I said, the doctor told me at the time that everything was normal, but this was a neurologist that told me, like, everything's fine. Well, I came across the paper and I discovered that she has the Prothrombin Gene Mutation. She has it. And it was on the paper she gave me, but she told me that everything came back normal. The only thing I can think of is, as a neurologist, she might know, like, oh, that's this blood clotting disorder, and maybe she, like, looked into what does that mean, and then thought, oh, well, you don't do anything to a kid who has this. You don't give her medication or whatever. So maybe she just kind of brushed it off and was like, everything's fine. I was aggravated when I discovered that she had this because, first of all, if she would have told me, oh, she has this, but there's nothing we're going to do to treat her, but you should probably get tested for it because she inherited this from either you or your husband, and you have had 2 babies who had strokes, and you had a loss due to a blood clot. So you should probably get tested for this, because if you have it, you should know that you have it. That was never told to me. So I think it's really unfortunate that I couldn't know that ahead of time. I mean, obviously, if my daughter has factor 2 and she inherited it from one of her parents, I think that's pretty crucial for me as her mother to know, be tested, to, to figure out if I have it. If I had known and been on medication, my 26-week preemie might have made it all the way to term or close to term and just been delivered by C-section or whatever, but who knows what would have happened. But it really made me sad and scared for my almost 3-year-old when I found out that she had the factor 2. I know a lot of people have factor 2 and it doesn't really affect them really negatively. A lot of people go on to have babies and live normal lives and not have any issues with it, but just because of the issues that I've had and this devastation, and now, like I said, 3 babies in the NICU, one extremely premature, watched several of my babies struggle, just battle, fight for their lives. And this is a result of this prothrombin gene mutation. It really put it into perspective for me and put some fear in me that maybe I'd have to watch my daughter struggle with this too one day. She is young, like I said, not even 3, but still just thinking about how scary it is for myself and even my sisters who have not been tested. Like, what if any of this happens? They're still having babies. So I'm like, oh my gosh, what if they have it? And I begged them all to get tested for it. But I am making this video right now because yesterday was my oldest daughter's 12th birthday. And she recently had to have some blood work done for some other stuff. And I asked them to test her for a prothrombin gene mutation because I'm like, well, I have this and it's important. She's going to be going through puberty and it's really important for me to know if she has this. And I discovered she does have it. So that's 2 of my children who I discovered have the prothrombin gene mutation. The only 2 that have been tested came up positive for it. And it really hurts me to know, especially my oldest, she's always been healthy, and like to know like what's in her future when, if she wants to have children, when the time comes, for her to have to go on Lovenox or whatever, and just fearing for her to go through suffering like I did with my pregnancies, and just fearing that I'm going to have to just watch her go through this, and it's going to be really hard as her mother to watch her go through this because of this thing that I gave her. Obviously, it wasn't my choice to give it to her. It's not like I sat here and was like, I'm going to give her this gene. She just unfortunately got it from me. And eventually my other 3 will be tested for it as well. But I think more so than the boys, the girls, it's going to be harder. Like if I discover that my boys have it, it's going to be hard, but it's harder for me to know that my girls have it because the boys aren't going to be the ones having babies. Like, yeah, they might pass it to their kid if they have it, but they're not going to be pregnant. And there's obviously, in my case, there's just been such in pregnancies. So that's what I wanted to say today. I see you guys are watching my videos, so please be sure to subscribe if you like my videos. Comments, feel free to tell me about your experiences if you've had anything happen like I have. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.